Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 5 of Active Listening in Jazz. My name is Dan Adler, and today we're going to start to unlock the story of how melody and harmony are interrelated in jazz. In the previous episode, we spoke about the tune So What, and we showed its structure and talked about how Bill Evans explained that structure as 16 bars of one particular scale, followed by 8 bars of the same scale, a half a tone up, and then followed by 8 more bars of the scale, of the original scale. And now we're going to ask ourselves, how does this work? How does it work that when we have chords, we can make melodies on top of them? And to do that, we have to first talk about harmony in music in general. Harmony is really an outgrowth of both physics, the structure of our brain, and most importantly, culture and the way that music developed within Western civilization, as opposed to, say, the way it developed within Eastern or Arabic civilization, where quarter tones were used. Within the Western civilization, semitones were the smallest structure and or the building block, and so tonal harmony and melody developed based on that. And I'm going to read you a definition out of this book called The Harmonic Experience. And the definition goes like this. Harmony is about the agreement of things with one another. That's actually the meaning of the word in Greek. Among musicians, the term harmony usually refers to the way tones relate vertically, stacked up and sounding simultaneously as chords. So when we play multiple notes as one chord, we call that harmony. But a broader musical definition involves the way the ear relates pitches to one another in every dimension, including the agreeableness of the entire piece of music. So whether things sound good to us or don't sound good to us is, again, a function of history and of culture and of physics. And we can start quickly from the physics point of view, which dates back to the Greeks, Pythagoras, and basically the understanding that notes or musical tones are frequencies, and that when you half the length of a string, you get double the frequency. If you take 1/3 of the length of the string, you're going to get 3 times the frequency. 3 times the frequency will relate to something that we call in music a perfect fifth. When you divide a string into 4 equal parts, you quadruple the frequency and you get an octave. And so and when you divide it into 5 is when you get a tone that we call now the third. And this third interval is really the foundation of Western harmony. So to understand how this works, we're going to go back to the tune So What that we discussed in the previous episode. And I'm going to try and show you how the chords to that relate to the scales as were mentioned by Bill Evans in the description that we read. So here I'm using a virtual piano. And on this virtual piano, you can see the notes, and I can play them. And what you can see is whenever I play every third note, 1, this is the third, 1, 2, 3. Those sounds are, if I play them together, that is a chord or a major chord made up of thirds. The next chord, if I move over and I take the 3 white keys that are spaced 2 apart, this will be a D minor chord, and this will be the chord that is actually used in the tune So What. In fact, it says D minor 7 in that chord chart that we had before. D minor 7 occurs by taking every third note and taking the next one. So if you see what happens here when I play the first, the third, and this is the fifth, and then the next one would be the 7th. So I have a 4-note chord, and this sounds like a D minor 7 chord, which is the chord that is used in So What. And all I did was use the every other white key starting from the note D. And that is just a beautiful chord based on the way the keyboard is laid out, and based on the way these tonal relationships work, and based on the way our ear perceives it, and that comes out of the music. So now, when we play these notes together, the question is what notes would sound good on it. And we can see that if we play the same notes in the octave above, that will sound good. If I also play all the notes from D to D, that will also sound good. All the white notes. And that, in jazz lingo, or actually in musical lingo, it's usually called a Dorian scale or a Dorian mode. And basically it's just the white keys between D and D. So now, getting back to the tune So What, we want to look at the melody. And the melody starts on the 5th note of the scale. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it's really just 5 notes consecutively. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then going back 2 down and back up to D. So that is how the melody works. And actually, the same melody could be played from the 1st note of the scale. So that would sound like this. Combining both of them. So different ideas can be played on the same chords now. For example, if we go... That's one of the ideas that Miles plays in his solo. And then that's another idea that Miles plays in his solo. There are many melodies that I could play on top of this one chord, and that would either come out of the scale and sound good because they're part of the scale, or they might include some passing tones, say notes that would... So in this case, I included the passing tone because it was on the way to another tone that was in the scale. So again, these are just an outgrowth of the way music works, the way the keyboard is laid out and the way things sound to us. The fact that you can play a chord and put different melodies on top of it is really the heart of what jazz musicians try to do. They say, okay, I have a chord. What types of melodies would work on top of that chord besides the original melody of the tune? And maybe I can relate to the original melody of the tune, or maybe I could play something that's unrelated at all, or maybe I can play around with the rhythmic units of the tune. But basically, this is where I get my ideas. I get my ideas from this scale. And when the chord changes, when the chord now becomes a different chord, then I have to rethink what are the set of notes that fit that chord. And so the material that jazz musicians use in order to figure out what to play on top of a set of chords originates from the chord scales, or from notes within the chord, or from something that relates to the music, to the melodic structure of the underlying harmony. We can relate this back to the more general question of what are the jazz musicians doing? They are taking a structure, which we call the form, and in the case of So What, we were talking about a 32-bar form. That means 32 bars of music that get repeated over and over again until, with the melody in the beginning, the melody in the end, and then the chordal structure, meaning the place where the chords change, and the form repeating itself. So you have this constant piece, which is really, you could say, these are the rules. We saw right now exactly how the harmony defines the rules for what works melodically, or at least gives you the universe of reasonable things to play on top of a given form or a given chord structure. And then it's up to the jazz musician to figure out what to play out of all those possible notes in order to create alternative melodies on top of this form and on top of this chord structure. So really now this is what starting to get to the heart of the question of what people are doing in jazz. And as we said in the first episode, the idea of how do you create 1 minute of music in 1 minute time, and the way it works is through these set of rules. You have these set of rules that say, you know, I'm keeping the form constant, I'm keeping the set of chords constant, which sometimes we call the chord changes, and then on top of that, I'm going to try and invent melodies. Historically speaking, this is a huge breakthrough. Until jazz was invented by the early African American innovators, the idea in music was always that you had a performer and you had a composer. The composer created the music over a lengthy period of time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes years. And then the performer would study the music, would learn all the nuances, and would perform it to the audience in a way that was optimal to hearing and also which expressed their own individuality. But in jazz, we took the composer and we took the performer and we put them together, and we left zero time between the time of composition and the time of performance. And so the jazz musician has to both be a composer, has to be a musical theorist, has to understand those relationships between the chords and the melodies, and also on top of that has to understand rhythm, and on top of that has to interact with all the other people in the group. So you have a form of collective expression with some rules, and within those rules, the musicians are creating something new, and every time they play it, even though some parts of it might be constant, the vast majority, or at least some parts of the form, are going to be improvised, and those are going to be different every time. And they're not just going to be different in terms of the notes that each soloist play, they're also going to be different in terms of the interaction between the group members and how all of those things come together to a performance. So really, you're starting to see the ingenuity of jazz, where you have musicians that are at the same time creators, they are theoretical thinkers, and they are musical composers, and all of that is happening in real time. It never really existed in the history of music or in the history of human expression, the idea that multiple people can be together on one stage in one place and create something together at the same time. You have other forms where people might be improvising or might be working off of each other, say like music, like comedy improvising. But here they're all working at the same time. They're creating something together, and really it's a unique form of human expression. And the more you learn to appreciate what is going on within this context of jazz, of a jazz ensemble, you will start to see how unique this is as a art form, and why people who are jazz fans think about this as really something unique in the history of human expression. So thank you very much for joining me for episode 5 of Active Listening in Jazz, and I will see you in episode 6.